for what it's worth. Remembering before I start your three responsibilities: the responsibility to yourself, to Almighty God, to your community, your state, and then your nation. Then hitch your wagon to a star and stay on the single track. Although the going may be rough, there is no turning back. Eyes straight ahead and shoulders back, with heart both stout and true. There may be miles of walking, but there is a place for you. So keep your eye upon that star and think from whence you came. You may not be the president, but you will win your fame. Thank you, and God bless each of you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor Brown. And we really were glad to see you arrive here tonight and have you with us. There were several people on the platform that were hurriedly trying to prepare commencement addresses tonight because the Lieutenant Governor hadn't arrived, and we're certainly pleased to have him here and to be able to share in his inspirational remarks tonight. Dr. Wilson and Reverend Wells, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Moore and Mr. Kyle, family and friends of the graduates and honored graduates of the class of 1965. It is my privilege as the principal of Cuyahoga Falls High School to present this very fine class for graduation here tonight. On behalf of all of the faculty and the students of our school, I wish to congratulate you all for successfully completing your high school work. At the same time, we want to commend all of you for your many fine achievements and to wish all of you Godspeed in your future endeavors. One of the ways which a high school such as ours gains its reputation and its stature in the community and in the state is through the accomplishments of its graduates. We feel confident tonight that this, the class of 1965, will add considerable luster to the reputation and the standing of our school. During the 3 years that this class has been in our school, they have won many honors and have already added much distinction to our school. They have been an exceptionally talented class and have contributed in many ways to both their school and to their community. As teachers, we have been rewarded by our association with them. We trust that our hopes and aspirations for the future of our community and of our country will be fulfilled in them. And as their parents and friends, you who have come here tonight to be witness to this graduation can feel honored and gratified by your part in their achievements. As parents, you have been much more than providers of physical needs, of some of the ordinary comforts of life, and of spending money. You have been their chief source of security, encouragement, and inspiration. And what these graduates are, we recognize is a credit to you, their parents. Dr. Wilson and members of the Cuyahoga Falls Board of Education, I assure you that all of these graduates have met all of the requirements of the state of Ohio and of the Cuyahoga Falls Board of Education. They are now ready to receive their diplomas, and Mr. Alfred Marshall, the unit principal for this class, will share with me in calling the names And Mr. Robert Kyle, the President of the Board of Education, and Mr. William Moore, the Vice President of the Board of Education, will present them with their diplomas. That's it. Put one in his hand and we'll be ready to go. Robert Baird Murray III.
Linda Marie Arment.
Linda Susan Acorn.
Howard David Absalom.
Hans Lorenz Aronson III.
Lucinda Jane Adams.
June Louise Albaugh.
Susan Alstad.
Ruth Ann Alexander.
Pamela Jean Allen.
Lloyd Douglas Alley.
John David Anderson.
Susan Marie Connolly.
Stephen Thomas Carson.
William Edward Andrea.
Cynthia Jane Ammon.
Anna Ruth Anderson, absent.
John David Antonoli.
Judith K. Anderson.
Barbara Jean Appleby.
Kurt R. Appleman.
Ronald Joseph Arbaugh III.
Kathleen Elise Atkinson.
Linda Jeanette Artry.
Raymond Aubrey Archer III.
Donald Paul Armstrong.
Leela Criswell Baird.
Cynthia Lee Barnes.
Nancy Joe Beal.
Linda Mae Bowie.
Janet Jerry Bonstell.
Laura Ann Bartlett.
Henrietta Margaret Backer.
Horace Leroy Arnold Jr.
Gregory Paul Arndt.
Margie Lorraine Benish.
Jean Teresa Bellasack.
Donna Mae Bentley.
Sally Jean Benson.
Gary Robert Arts.
Charles Brown Arp III.
Jean K. Billings.
Karen Ann Betts.
Beverly Ann Blocker.
Pamela K. Deeds.
Robert Dale Atchison.
Harry Lavelle Ash III.
Rebecca K. Bond.
Bonnie Lynn Bolden.
Mary Allen Bookman.
Pamela K. Busenbark.
Barbara Ann Boris.
Barbara Louise Bolton.
Beatrice Marie Bowers.
James Patrick Ayers.
Donald Howard Bachtel.
Nancy Carolyn Bowers.
Cynthia Kyle Brackett.
David Milton Backlund.
Robert Edward Bacon.
Cheryl Ann Braddock.
Diane Carol Brandymart.
Robert Lance Bedini.
Roger K. Bain.
Bonnie Louise Brandt.
Sherry Lynn Brothers.
Raymond John Bachmuller.
William Thomas Barnett.
Edwin Richard Barnard, Jr.
Sharon Ann Caldwell.
Carrie Lee Browning.
Susan Marie Callahan.
Linda Lee Kaler.
John Elvin Beal.
Robert Michael Barrett.
Ruth Ann Capes.
Diana Lynn Capriani.
James Carey Bidwell.
John Leslie Bibler,
Nancy Ann Carpenter,
Linda Lou Carlton,
Robert Louis Byer,
Sandra Lynn Carper,
Gerald Stephen Bachmuller,
James Garfield Blackstock,
David Arthur Bond,
Pamela Gay Carter,
Betsy Ann Carter,
Michael Paul Bolañu,
Brian Harold Bolt,
Rita Marie Catanese,
Marilyn Sue Chadwell,
Robert Carl Bordenkircher,
John David Bauer,
Marjorie Lynn Chapin,
Sandra Lee Christ,
Larry James Box,
Milton Eugene Brackett,
Patricia Allen Clary,
Patricia Ray Clayton,
Walter Richard Brigger,
David Thomas Brooks,
Bonnie Luella Kraus,
Bonnie Marie Clinton,
Linda Irene Clifford,
Jeffrey Kim Brown,
Jean Charles Brown,
Jonelle Coleman,
Kay Louise Caulfield,
Edward Louis Brunyansky,
Ronald Lee Brumbaugh,
Lynn Lorraine Cooper,
Linda Lee Combs,
Terry Lee Bollitt,
Louis Michael Brunyansky,
Kathy Marie Cox,
Mary Jane Costill,
Mark Edward Burrell,
William Kenneth Burley,
Juanita Jane Crane,
Charlene May Crabtree,
Robert Louis By,
Gary Howard Butler,
Sandra Jane Cunningham,
William Nelson By,
Ronald Lee Kale,
Mary Claire Curley,
Sandra Lee Sablicki,
Dennis Brian Cameron,
Paul Edward Candlish,
Linda Michelle Setley,
Karen Rose DiAlicio,
David Edward Cardarella,
Richard Allen Carlton,
Maureen Ann Dalton,
Donna Jean Davison,
John Wesley Carpenter,
Christopher Patrick Carricker,
Christine Louise Davis,
Maura Davis,
Fred Lee Carter,
John Andrew Carter,
Timothy McKee Cross,
Linda Carol Deering,
Victoria Ann Davis,
Paul Edward Coiner,
Christopher Howard Chandler,
Portia Mae DeMarco,
Thomas Patrick Ciccarelli,
Dennis Robert Cole,
Gail Regan Dice,
Barbara June DeSalle,
Dennis Robert Cole,
Warren Earl Colligan,
Janice Marie DeRose,
Pamela Diane Dickerson,
Edward Russell Cole,
Ralph Edward Cooper,
Patricia Mary Dick,
Sandra Sue Tice DeShong,
Jacob Edward Cook Jr.,
David Timothy Cope,
Sue Ann Dillon,
Marilyn Cecilia Dooley,
Bondi Page Dix,
Gilbert Dale Cotton,
Terry Lee Corrado,
Mary Dorcas Downer,
Jimmy Joe Douglas,
James David Crabtree,
Lynn Richard Cox,
Paula Sue Doyle,
Marilyn Marie Doxey,
Daniel Robert Crawford,
John Dale Crane,
Nancy Jean Dugan,
Vicki Lee Drosno,
James Leroy Croft,
Richard Paul Crawford,
Catherine Bridget Ebner,
Karen Sue Durfee,
Gerald Allen Cunningham, deceased,
Darlene Carol Fernbach,
Mary Ann Francis Ferrante,
Walter Preston Curtis III,
Marilyn Joan Edwards,
Lee Ann Eisenzimmer,
Thomas Edward Dowshy,
Cheryl Ann Eber,
Caroline Joyce Elliott,
Darla May Emery,
Edward Hay Davidian,
Richard Paul Davis,
Sandra Lee Emerson,
Ellen Louise Emick,
William Arthur Diedemeyer,
David Michael Del Pozo,
Rosemary Ann Evans,
Kathleen Ann Fair,
Robert Walker Denning,
Patrick William Darden,
Cynthia Ann Fairhurst,
Jennifer Lynn Ferris,
John Richard Devine,
David Arthur Dick,
Michael Joseph Dick,
Pamela Ray Farrell,
Nancy Jean Fluharty,
John Nathan Dybel,
Jack Edward Dollar,
Linda Diane Folk,
Cheryl Lee Forshee,
Arthur Christopher Downey,
Tim Myron Dudich,
Nancy Ann Forshee,
Nancy Elaine Fox,
James Martin Dukerich,
Thomas Everett Duplaga,
Marilyn Ann Franklin,
Rebecca Joe Frazier,
Kenneth Edward Durfee,
Charles Luther Duvall,
Mary Jo Grafe,
Constance Darlene Granger,
William Perry Dyke,
David Lee Easton,
Stacy Lynn Friedman,
Carla Susan Fedor,
Paul Peter Eberhart,
Leanne Garforth,
Constance Dawn Garrett,
Gary Stephen Eber,
Thomas Jean Eber,
Jacqueline Phyllis Garver,
Mary Sandra Givens,
William Ross Emery,
James Hugh Ensley,
Kathy Irene Givler,
Iris Lee Glasgow,
John David Irwin,
Alvy James Evans,
Kathleen Ethel Gutchaw,
Martha Cameron Gove,
Richard Edward Fair,
David Robert Farrell,
James Robert Farrell,
Janice Marie Gray,
Sharon Gale Gray,
Ronald Lee Pfeiffer,
Nicholas Anthony Filing,
Virginia Lee Greenwood,
Karen Lee Gross,
Kenneth Edward Fillinger,
John Thomas Finn,
Linda Diane Gubank,
Amelia Ann Gulia,
Ronald David Fischel,
John Robert Forshee,
Barbara M. Gunter,
Joanne Nola Gazetta,
Frederick Carl Frakes,
Ross Taylor France,
Sally Ann Hott,
Penny Lee Hopridge,
David Lloyd Frank,
Denise Kathleen Graysa,
Joyce Ann Haas,
Dennis William Fred,
Terrence Lee Fritch,
Vicki Lynn Habian,
Jean Ann Haggerty,
Todd Lewis Fritch,
Frederick Dale Fry,
Linda Lou Haydnick,
Joanne Haynes,
Frederick James Freiberger,
Stephen Lewis Fuller,
Mary Beth Hammock,
Jean Hannum,
Clark Thomas Gallagher,
Ronald Michael Garsky,
Ruth Marie Hanson,
Judith Lynn Haar,
Charles Craig Gaston,
Robert William Gates,
Glenn Frederick Gelker,
Linda Jane Hawks,
Catherine Ann Haynes,
John Allen Gerard,
James Robert Gilbert,
Nancy Edith Heacock,
Nancy Jean Hingle,
Dorothy Ann Herbruck,
Carol Ann Hilton,
Philip Edwards Glanville,
Earl Louis Glazer,
Linda Elizabeth Height,
Paula Jean Hobart,
Arthur Lewis Gleason, Jr.,
Russell Everett Greathouse, absent,
Darrell Ann Hollingshead,
George James Goodyear III,
Jeffrey Corder Hall,
Darlene Joy Hosner,
Leonard Joseph Gosshorn,
Philip Thomas Haynes,
Pamela June Hauer,
Linda Noreen Harvey,
Margot Jane Humphrey,
Jeffrey Edward Gosner,
Robert James Graham,
Gloria Elaine Hudkins,
Sandra Jean Huss,
Peggy Lynn Hunnell,
Richard Vincent Green II,
Frances Joanne Infantino,
Leslie Ellen Irvin,
Jeffrey Allen Green,
Timothy John Ginter,
Jean Adele Ayo,
Patricia Ann Jackley,
Valerie Ann Jacobs,
Stephen James Gursky,
David Michael Hack,
Elizabeth Victoria Janeda,
Sharon Lee Janae,
Diane Jean Jenkins,
Robert Glinton Heller,
Joan Louise Johnson,
Candace Jane Johnson,
Thomas Lloyd Hamlin,
Joeen Ray Johnson,
Susan Marie Johnson,
James Russell Harper,
David Edward Harris,
Christina Lord Jones,
Donna Lee Jones,
Robert Ellison Harris,
William Daniel Harris,
Sharon Ann Jones,
Bonnie Jean Castine,
Thomas J. Harrod,
Thomas Robert Hart,
Elizabeth Keith,
Cheryl Adeline Kempton,
Richard Lewis Heck,
Susan Elizabeth Cruz,
Dorothy Grace Kierstead,
Roy David Helbling,
Michael Edward Hudkins,
Linda Lee Kilborn,
Kathleen Gale Kilgore, absent,
Linda Irene Kirk,
Judith Ann Klang,
Thomas Craig Hemsley,
Raymond Lawrence Huser,
Virginia Kleinhans,
Judith May Neifel,
Richard Lewis Hickstead,
Robert Roy Heyer,
Jo Marie Cecilia Knowles,
Linda K. Knotts,
George Stephen Hoffman,
Eugene Richard Hoskins,
Rebecca Sue Knotts,
Joyce Kathleen Kosis,
David Allen Hostetler,
Donald Charles Howard,
Karen Jean Kepke,
Patricia Ann Kramer,
Vladia Rodriguez de Magallanes,
Frank Theodore Keith,
Kathleen Ann Kunkel,
Nancy Lee Rose Lawson,
Michael Patrick Hunnell,
Mary Jo Kuchenbrod,
Hollis Ann Caruso,
Paula K. Kurth,
Lawrence Emerson Inks,
William John Hunter,
Janet Elizabeth Lamb,
Susan Margaret Lobby,
James Edward Jacobs,
David Thomas Eisner,
Donna Lynn LaRocca,
Shirley May Lance,
William Richard Jenkins,
Mark Christian Jeffries,
Sandra Jean LaRue,
Jane Frances LaRue,
Melvin Kasanchik Jr.,
Robert Allen Johnston,
John Joseph Kaiser,
Wesley Douglas Kidd, absent,
Linda Jane Lawrence,
Linda Marie Lauderhahn,
John William Kennedy,
Dennis Carl Kranick,
Yolanda Marie Lear,
Robert Delson Kearns,
Rebecca Ann Lewis,
Judith Ann Lees,
Bonnie Louise Lindway,
Robert Joseph Kidney,
Howard Edward King,
Linda Lee Lindsay,
Connie Ray Lutz,
Marcia K. Little,
Bob Fred Klingelhaber,
Burton Cletus Clapp II,
Kathy Jo McIntyre,
Karen Ann Lyle,
Robert Thomas Nepper,
Thomas William Knepp,
Jerome Edward Keel,
Helen Rose Mack,
Judith Louise Markwalder,
Darlene Marie McColgan,
Kathleen Martins,
Steve Arthur Koshin,
Gary Rupert Lanier,
Anita Louise Marcella,
Jean Ellen Mathis,
Larry Ray Lance,
Robert Sherwood Lash,
Susan Adelia Marquis,
Mary Martha Maxwell,
Linda Lee Matheny,
Carl Middleton Lehman III,
Ronald Large,
Linda Joan McCall,
Nadine Lee McAdams,
James Walter Lynch,
Gary Keith Lawrence,
Maureen Elaine Meadows,
Janet Lynn McBee,
Geraldine Kendall McCormick,
Bud Otto Leisering,
James Richard Leone,
Barbara Louise McCall,
Catherine Rose McCutcheon,
Charles Dennis Mahan,
Robert Curtis Lewis,
Margaret Mary McDevitt,
Pamela K. McFarland,
Thomas Cassidy Lewis III,
Thomas Hampton Layden,
Mary Joan McIntyre,
Connie Jane McKinley,
Samuel Salvador Lavini,
Wayne Milan Lonchard,
Gail Marie McLean,
Cheryl Diane McClelland,
Richard Allen Long,
William Joseph Longitano,
Joan Yvonne McMillan,
Kenneth Lee Matheny,
Ronald Dean Luganville,
Jeffrey Allen Mallory,
Linda Lou McQuiston,
Carol Lynn Mellinger,
David Scott Masters,
Robert Thomas Mansfield,
Linda Jo Miller,
Christine Lynn Metz,
Nancy June Mealy,
John Robert Markov,
John Bart Mandela,
Dorothy Ann Miller,
Pamela Ruth Merriman,
Rustin Charles Marsh,
Donald Joseph Manson,
Nancy Arlene Morrissey,
Susan Ruth Miles,
Jacqueline Sue Miller,
Mark Anthony Marculin,
William Richard Matthew,
Alice Louise Moser,
Shirley Joe Miller,
Timothy David Meyer,
Robert Charles McCluskey,
Susan Elizabeth Miller, Ronald Alexander Sampson,
Wayne Allen Seastead,
Pamela Lee Spurndle,
Donna Jean Talmadge,
Bruce Edward Semmelsberger,
Robert James Seaver,
Barbara K. Tell,
Shirley Marie Tolosi,
Donna Ray Sumwall,
Joseph Stephen Seapos,
Gary Robert Schultz,
Cheryl Ann Tench,
Patricia Jean Sweet,
Lynn Taylor Schaefer,
Daniel Ray Schutz,
Patricia Jean Thomas,
Vicki Jean Swiger,
Robert Martin Shannon,
Richard Lerner Schwab,
Anita Louise Thompson,
Sharon Ruth Seifert,
Gary Irvin Shiflett,
Howard Russell Smith,
Diane Louise Thompson,
Florence Elaine Tish,
Gary Lee Sickman, absent,
Dennis Lee Spangler,
Sandra Michelle Thornsberry,
Susan Lynn Tonge,
Ralph Denzel Smart, Jr.,
John Weissert Stafford,
Marcia Lynn Tillinger,
John Ralph Seymour,
John Russell Smith,
Bonnie Lou Thomas,
Linda Mae Tisch,
Robert Ellis Shaheen,
Richard Paul Spielman,
Susan Patricia Thomas,
Kathleen Mary Tolles,
James Nelson Sharps,
William Harold Stewart,
Barbara Gail Thompson,
Nancy Carol Tresh,
Kenneth Carl Shumway,
Frank Strapoli,
Constance Elise Thorne,
Nancy Concetta Ulickney,
Arnold Edward Simon Jr.,
Timothy Gale Sutphen,
Carl Maya Tillett,
Laura Marie Vaquera,
William Robert Taylor,
Susan K. Vance,
Donna Lynn Veerling,
William Holloway Taylor,
Mary Jane Travers,
Susan Gale Van Horn,
Roy James Strait Jr.,
Thomas Andrew Theobald, absent,
Catherine Elizabeth Troutman,
Sandra Jean Von Gunten,
Gary Howard Stump,
Robert Charles Thorson,
Frederica Ann Umstead,
Beverly Ann Vaux,
Thomas Myro Sutter,
Carl Edward Tierney,
Roberta Ann Vanetta,
Barbara Michelle Vacator,
Gary Lee Tarbett,
David Allen Thompson,
Diane Lee Warner,
Janice K. Walker,
Larry Dale Vanderveer,
George Richard Udivari,
Sandra Ann Watson,
Kathleen Marie Wiley,
Paul Arnold Veering,
Michael Eugene Vale,
Jane Constance Weber,
Anita Jean Warner,
James Leland Thompson,
Anthony Dean Vamvis,
Elizabeth Ann Voorhees,
Janet Watkins,
Norman Roy Trefall,
Gregory James Van Boven,
Nancy Lee Vosetic,
Janus Watkins,
Kenneth Henry Tillman,
Ronald Albert Van Horn,
Charlotte K. Wakefield,
Linda Jean Weaver,
Dale Barton Tubal,
Andrew Charles Voth,
Nancy Lynn Wallace,
Laura Kathleen Weber,
Mark Frederick Allum,
William Dean Wayne,
Mary Ann Ward,
Susan Dolores Welty,
Lynn Rockwood Valley,
Lawrence Preston Watson,
Kathy Lee Williams,
Jeffrey Craig Weiss,
Roy Eric Wendt,
Rebecca Faye Wilgus,
Larry George Vukovich,
Alan David Wendt,
Diane Lynn Wells,
Diane Lucinda Williams,
Joseph Edward Watson,
Richard Edward Wenzel,
Nancy Elizabeth Winger,
Francis Peter Wessinger,
Dwight Edward Weaver,
Barbara Jo Witherspoon,
Maureen Frances Whalen,
Ronald Gordon Wiley,
Cynthia Ann Whitney, absent,
Marcia Jean Woy,
Eric Reginald Weissum,
James Michael Williams,
Robert Thomas Woodson,
Janet Marie Wynn,
Evelyn Cheryl Wilson,
Robert Glenn Williams,
Robert Curtis White,
Margaret Jane Willett,
Barbara Ann Whaler,
Catherine Ann Wysinski,
William Chester Wilkinson,
Tyrone Hughes Winsett,
Penny J.R. Wright,
Donna Jean Young,
Larry Richard Williams,
Charles William Woodman,
Carolyn Jane Wire,
Joan Marie Juszczyk,
Paul Ellsworth Wilson II,
Leonard Michael York,
Sally Ray Yaknow,
Joanne Marie Zake,
James Brian Walcott,
Bruce Gordon Zittel,
Joanne Yukovich, Raymond Quentin Tapp, Judith Karen Zimmer.
Will the class of 1965 please stand? With the traditional switching of the tassels from left to right, we will officially become graduates. Will you please do this with me? Please be seated. With the presentation of the diplomas this evening, we have successfully completed 12 years of education. In the process of achieving this goal, we have shared together many joys, sorrows, victories, and defeats. During the past 3 years, each of us has had associations and memories which time cannot erase. However, we have not achieved this goal by ourselves. We owe a heartfelt thanks to a great many people. To Dr. Wilson and Dr. Weldy for their fine supervision and management of Falls High School. To our unit principal, Mr. Marshall, and to our counselors, Mrs. Ellis and Mr. Sauer, for their helpful guidance in the past 3 years, through thick and through thin, and even alarm clocks. To the faculty for the lessons they taught us, both in and out of the classroom, and to our classmates for the lessons they taught us in friendship and manners. But most of all, we thank our parents for their understanding discipline and for their faith in us during these trying adolescent years. On behalf of the class of 1965, I would like to express our deepest appreciation to all of you with a very sincere thank you. Numbering 844, we're the largest class ever to graduate from Falls High School. As Bob Russell mentioned at our banquet, there are those who say we are too large and too bulky to become unified. Well, perhaps we are large, and perhaps we could become more unified. But to those who say we're too large, I say the world is a big place too. And we of this larger class, who are made up of many different kinds of people, have a definite advantage. For the smaller classes in schools, where the students share the same ideas, the same interests, and the same common goals, have been deprived of one of the greatest learning experiences an educational facility can give, that of learning about people. And we can truly say that we've received a complete education. What we are to be, we are becoming, is our class motto. We have strived for an education, and through the help of others, we have obtained our diplomas. But now we are leaving this sheltered life and stepping into a new and challenging world in which we will meet many difficulties. As we meet these difficulties and begin to lose faith in ourselves, let us remember this one thought. I wept because I had no shoes, but then I saw a man who had no feet. We have truly been a fortunate class, and we cannot fully realize at this time how fortunate we have been. So let us strive for success, and may we succeed. For with our generation rests not only our own destiny, but the fate of the entire world. Goodbye, good luck, and God bless you.
Shall we stand for the benediction? Now may the blessings of God be upon you. May his truth direct you and his love sustain you. And may he preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth, even forevermore. Amen.